Dawn. A time of beginnings. A time of endings. The birth of a new day. The death of a dark night. With the sun comes hope for a fresh start. Fear of a bitter demise. It was thus when the sun rose in the western skies over the dazzling white city of Caldor. As light slowly filled the marble-clad streets, movement could be seen. People were wandering around slowly through the soft, glowing streets and alleyways. For some, it was the beginning of a day's work. For others, it was the end of a hard night of toil. In the marketplace, stalls had already been uncovered and items placed upon them. The owners of the stalls called out to the people passing by. All were hoping to sell their goods. Most feared that they would sell nothing. Elsewhere in the city, guards patrolled the outer walls and stood watch at the three main gates. On the docks, men hauled crates on and off the ships that were moored to Caldor's many piers and jetties, whilst the fishermen carried ashore their night's catch. Smoke rose from the many bakeries, and the smell of freshly baked bread drifted across the city on a soft breeze. Darker smoke rose from the other buildings, as smithies stoked their fires in preparations for the new day. Several carts filled with piles of scrap metal and assorted jumble were pulled through the streets by large, lumbering horses. Upon the carts sat tired men and women who punctuated the quiet morning air with cries for iron and scrap. Occasionally a door would open and a man or woman would leave with arms filled with bundles of items. These were placed on the cart and money exchanged hands. One such cart ambled slowly along the walls of the palace, unaware that within one of its inner courtyards knights on horseback were forming ranks with stately grace. Inside the glistening palace itself, servants went about their daily tasks, some cleaning its vast halls and many chambers, others preparing breakfast for the many noblemen and courtiers that resided there, most of whom would not be up until mid-morning. Unlike most noble people, King Nathan II, of the house Taranon, Lord of the county of Darrenshire, protector of the people, ruler of Caldor, bearer of the truth of Torek, was already awake before the first rays of the sun had risen over the western ocean. He now stood at his window, looking out over Caldor. It was the first city of Caldor, and also its largest. From his window he could see most of the city as it radiated around the hill upon which the palace was built. He could even see the movements in the streets as the city began to awaken. He clenched his fist angrily as he watched the apparent peaceful scene. It was all a facade. The dazzling white beauty of Caldor was false. The buildings had not been made of marble, merely covered with it. The outer shell built merely to disguise the ugliness of the old, decaying buildings beneath. This could also be said of his people. Many appeared to be good-natured people who walked in the light of Torek. However, the old saying, often quoted by his mother, entered unbidden into his mind. Beneath the skin of beauty often lies great ugliness and sin. This had been true when she had been queen, and was still true today. He was surrounded by problems. Crime was rife, public discontent was high, and heresy widespread. He smiled bitterly at the irony of it. He was supposed to bring the truth of Torek to the heretics of Kolth and Sol, yet could not do so in his own city, in his own land. The smile turned to a scowl, and he slapped his fist angrily on the windowsill. All of the power at his command, and he still could not bring order to his own city. Caldor, first city of both King's country and King's land. In fact, things seemed to be getting worse. Almost 2 months ago, a knight had been found with his throat slit. This was not entirely unusual, for people were murdered in Caldor, although rarely. What made it unusual was that the knight had been asleep in his room with the door closed and locked from the inside. The window had also been locked, and there was no other entrance to the room. Nathan's personal friend and sorcerer, Matthew, had been there, and had only been able to discern that magic had been involved, as if that had not been plainly obvious to anyone in the room. To make matters worse, this had not been the only killing that night. There had been 4 other murders, all of them knights, and all of them with their throats slit. The following nights, several more knights were killed, and the same thing had happened every night since. The problem was that only one person had ever seen the killer, and she was a drunkard and a woman of the streets, another problem he had yet to stamp out. She had seen one of the murders and had claimed to have seen a man leap silently from the shadows and swiftly kill a knight. She then claimed that he had disappeared back into the shadows, that he had literally vanished into thin air. Nathan would not have believed the report of such an unreliable witness if Matthew had not confirmed it. Apparently he had sensed some faint traces of magic at the scene of the death, which meant that the man could have indeed vanished. They had returned to every other site, and each time the result had been confirmed. They had all involved a similar magic, but once again that told them very little, as Matthew had said that the patterns had been very unusual, whatever that meant. Even armed with that knowledge, his seekers from the Covenant Knights, commonly called Grey Knights, had thus far been unsuccessful in finding this evil practitioner of the dark arts. An involuntary shudder went through Nathan. He shared his people's distrust of sorcerer's magic, even though his best friend used such magic himself. Many of his commanding knights used magic, including the Seekers, and even he himself had been schooled in it. The only magic he felt comfortable with was that granted by Toric, and the rest he tolerated as long as he had some control over the users, even Matthew. A distant shout in the streets broke his concentration, and he looked out at the city once more. Somewhere in the streets a large argument had begun, but Nathan could not find the source of the commotion. It had to be somewhere just past the palace walls, where it was close enough to hear snatches of the argument. Intrigued despite himself, he had leaned out of the window in an attempt to hear more. Suddenly, a gentle cough behind him caused him to jump and set his heart racing in fear. "Excuse me, sire," said an infinitely formal voice behind him, "but may I be of service?" Relieved, Nathan groaned slightly and turned to face his aging valet. "For Toric's sake, Luca, how many times will I have to say I'm sorry?" he asked almost desperately. "I beg your pardon, your majesty?" asked Luca with a stiff, questioning bow. "I'm really sorry about the way I snapped at you, Luca," said Nathan, almost pleading. With Luca, kingly dignity or commands rarely worked as expected. "Now, please, could you stop playing the part of my formal servant and let bygones be bygones, please?" I'm sorry, your majesty," replied Luca, his voice betraying no emotion, remaining strictly formal. "But I distinctly remember you telling me to keep to my station of life and not to meddle in yours. If you'll pardon my bluntness, your majesty." Nathan gave up. Luca Horn had been his valet for as long as he could remember, and the old man was like a father to him. He was also one of the few people who had not treated him differently upon his coronation, until now. It had started 2 days ago when Nathan received the news that both Coltham Empire and the country of Sol were sending ambassadors to discuss his intentions over the invasion of Grelchin. Nathan had been expecting those from Sol, as he had been planning a formal visit from the ruler Sulan the 25th. But the fact that Kolth had sent an ambassador too had disrupted his plans. Luca had made some helpful comment, and in a flare of unexplainable rage, Nathan had shouted at his manservant. A pained look had then crossed the weathered face, and he had been unbearably polite and formal ever since. "I see that your majesty has dressed himself," said Luca, eyeing him critically. You could hear the capital M in every majesty. "Does your majesty require my services at this precise moment?" "As you correctly assessed, I am dressed and have no further need for your services, Master Horn," replied Nathan in resignation. Luca stood there, regarding him for a few minutes. Then he spoke. "You no longer need my services?" he asked in mock amazement. "Have you seen yourself? Look in the mirror. You look a right state. You couldn't dress well if your life depended on it. Let me see to it." The old man came closer and to Nathan and began to fiddle with his clothing. Nathan stood, trying to hide his pleasure that his old friend had returned to him. To do this, he waited patiently and gazed at his reflection in the mirror. He could not see what was wrong, but knew that Luca would not leave until he was satisfied that Nathan was dressed properly. He shook his head and smiled slightly. A slight glance from Luca, and he promptly fixed his face back to the mirror, the smile almost disappearing. "Have you heard news from Gareth yet?" asked Luca without bothering to look up from his work. "No. The last I heard, the main forces were nearing Grelchin." Gareth, his brother, was leading his army into the heart of Grelchin. Nathan had not intended to go to war quite so soon, for his troops were still quite small in number. However, The increasing number of goblin raids in the eastern counties had forced him to retaliate, until the conflict had escalated into full-scale war. Thankfully, his brother was a skilled general and had consistently led his forces to victory. He was also aided by the fact that the goblins had put up very little in the way of organised resistance. According to the weekly reports, it was little more of a massacre than a war. At the rate his forces were advancing, Grelchin would be taken within the next couple of months. It was likely this would cause both the northern lands to send ambassadors to him. Sol was evidently worried that he would move his campaign northwards, and the Colthon Senate was almost certain wanted to see if Caldor was weak enough to invade. Now he'd have to try and convince the heathen ambassadors that his intentions were essentially peaceful. That meant lying and treating them with the respect they did not deserve. Surely, said Caldor the Pure had not such problems, he thought, as he sighed softly. No, I'll bet that Sir Caldor didn't have such problems, said Luca, fumbling with Nathan's shirt. Nathan had become almost used to the way that the wizened old man seemed to be able to read his thoughts. What with that man they call the Shadow killing them knights right, left and centre, as well as that war and the problems with the Empire and Sol. But I'm sure you'll see him through admirably. Of course, if he'd finished what he'd started, we wouldn't be in such a pickle. Nathan nodded in agreement. Many years ago his people had been enslaved by the vile goblins and forced to do all manner of torturous work. Then Caldor, with his magical sword Caliban, had united the humans and led them into a revolt against their goblin oppressors. Not only that, but he carved a kingdom out of Caldor out of the western lands of Grelchin before leading them to victory against the legions of Kolth. The treaty had forced them to sign on his victory had lasted to the present day. The Emperor Tynasis would love to get revenge for that ancient defeat. If Sir Caldor had finished what he had started, Nathan wouldn't be in the trouble he was today. However, that was all in the past and could not be altered. One day he would finish the work and the entire human race would stand in the light of Torek. Finished, said Luca, stepping back to admire his work. Now you look like a real Kingshott. Thank you, Luca, replied Nathan, daring to give a smile. He looked at himself in the full-length mirror that stood in the corner of his room. He was not surprised to see that he did look much better. Somehow the clothes seemed to hang off him in a more regal manner. Luca seemed to have a magic touch when it came to clothes. It was a shame that this touch did not extend to his face. You could see that it was drawn from the lack of sleep, and his thin, blonde hair lay haphazardly on his scalp. His short beard did not hide the paleness of his face, and nothing could be done about the bloodshot eyes, which were all but drowned out by the blue irises. He knew that he might be considered fairly handsome if he could get a good night's sleep, but he doubted such a thing existed. He wiped the tears of tiredness from his eyes, ignoring Luca's concerned look. You may go and have some breakfast, he said, returning his gaze to the window. Will you be eating today? Yes, after I have attended to a few matters of state, replied Nathan. Good, replied Luca with a nod. You know that breakfast is the most important meal of the day. He walked to the door and turned back around. But be warned, said the old man, waving his forefinger at Nathan. If I find out you skipped it, then I'll personally see to it that from now on you eat it, even if I have to spoon-feed you. With that, Luca walked out the room. Nathan shuddered at the thought of the warning he'd been given. Luca was quite likely to carry out his threat. He had done so once before when Nathan was 12. Even now he flushed with embarrassment at the memory. Luca could be worse than a mother hen sometimes. However, Luca's friendship was worth every bit of his mothering. He was Nathan's link to the general population. Through him he found out how the peasants were reacting to his new laws and taxes. How the old man found out he never knew, he did not really care. He was just glad for his advice, and the fact that it meant that Nathan was not completely tied to the information of his spy master, a shadowy figure whose identity was unknown even to him. Knowledge of the man's existence had only been passed on to him on the day of his coronation. He had found it very difficult to put faith in such a man, especially one that seemed to know so much. Luca's information helped relieve his unease, and gave him a slight edge in their encounters. At least, he hoped he did. Oh, I almost forgot to tell you, said Luca, startling Nathan as he reappeared at the door. Malcolm is looking for you. Something about the next Royal Council? Oh, Nathan groaned as Luca left. That was all he needed. There would be no avoiding the small man, and he could be forced to make a decision on the next council meeting. Why today? He asked silently. A loud clatter of metal drew his attention back to the window. Down in the courtyard, a young knight had just fallen off his horse. Nathan smiled with pride as he watched the commanding knight swing off his horse to help. A young man to be proud of, said a voice by his ear. Nathan swung around in surprise, reaching for his sword at his side. It was half drawn when he saw that it was his friend and advisor, Matthew, that stood before him.